Okay, so looking at the poem Loud by Carol Ann Duffy today. So this is another poem in the Feminine Gospels collection. It comes after Tall and before History. And it has many similarities to both Tall and History, I would say. But what sets it aside from all of the other poems in the collection is that Loud has an epigraph. And what I've got in the background here is the rest of the article that the epigraph is taken from. So you can see these three lines here are where the epigraph come from. Parents with mutilated children have been turned away and told from the empty hospital and told to hire smugglers to take them across the border to Quetta, a Pakistani frontier city at least 6 hours away by car. And this article is from The Guardian. It was published 28th of October 2001 following a mass attack which took place in Afghanistan. And obviously this is published, the collection of poems is published in 2002. So this was quite really recent for readers then. And of course, remember that the Afghanistan War on Terror, as it has come to be known, was instigated really by 9/11 and all the consequences of this was one of the consequences of 9/11. So in some ways Duffy here is making a political statement, and I've just because for AO3 context it's important to realise what was going on at the time in Afghanistan. So you've got if you're going back, you can go back as far as the Cold War, which isn't that far back, it's about 20 years earlier. 1979, the Soviet army invaded Afghanistan, which saw America supporting the Mujahideen, and that conflict went on for 10 years before the last Soviet troops withdrew in 1989. In 1996, the Taliban seized control of Kabul and introduced a hardline version of Islam, which included Sharia law, and Sharia law is effectively, well, it is very strict Islam. It's best known for things like having punishments that involve stoning to death, for example, perhaps of women committed adultery, but it's a very strict form of Islam with very strict rules. So in 1997, the Taliban was recognised as the legitimate ruler by Pakistan and Saudi Arabia. They were in control of about 2/3 of the country. In 1998, the US launched missile strikes at the suspected bases of Osama bin Laden, who had actually come from the Mujahideen, who they'd been supporting. In 1999, the UN imposed an air embargo and financial sanctions on Afghanistan, trying to get Osama bin Laden. In the September of 2001, you had Ahmad Shah Massoud assassinated, and of course not in Afghanistan itself. In the US you had the Twin Towers bombing, which led to US-led bombing in Afghanistan in October, and that's when this took place. It's after an attack during the October But then also relevant to reader in 2002, they would have seen that Afghan groups agreed a deal in Bonn, Germany, for an interim government in the December. And in January, there was deployment of the first contingent of foreign peacekeepers from NATO. So looking at some contrast, obviously I've already gone through some of this. So the epigraph actually appeared in The Guardian on Saturday the 27th of October 2001, but it's dated in Feminine Gospels as from the 28th. So on the 29th of October, the Telegraph printed a story about a church shooting, which is seen in the 5th stanza in italics. It was quite shocking. Obviously, on the 11th of September, there had been the Twin Towers bombing. And in October, the US started bombing Afghanistan. Looking at how typical this is of Duffy, you've got the Map Woman, in which Duffy references and quotes scenes from film. So very different, but she's still alluding to specific things in culture. Similarly, in Beautiful, Duffy recalls identifiable characters from history. So there's Helen of Troy, Cleopatra, Marilyn Monroe, and Princess Diana. She looks at in history. In Soap, Duffy alludes to various events in history, such as the World Cup 1966 and the moon landing, but various other, especially sporting events. And in Gambler, the horse names, if you look at them, Gambler isn't actually a poem that I'm going to cover. If you look at the horse names and the odds, they are direct quotations from a specific race which took place. So although these allusions are all very different, allusions of some sort are very typical of Duffy, ultimately. The Feminine Gospels, a common theme that you're going to be looking at is feminism. So I thought it worth noting that you've got the feminist slogan, "The personal is political," as a rallying cry for second wave feminists. It's worth remembering that because this is a very political poem. It is a very political poem, and that you can link in to the feminist movement. And the main character in the poem is a female. This is seen throughout the collection. So again, very typical of Duffy. And traditionally, it's been men who voice political opinions and make noise. So that make noise as in being loud. But I mean, it's less than 100 years since women have really started to come into politics. It's just over 100 years since women got the vote. But if you're talking about women actually being in politics, that has been a much slower process. And if you think back to the traditional Victorian ideal of the angel in the house, one of the characteristics of an ideal woman has been being quiet. Ideally being silent, but at least being quiet. So actually calling this poem loud and having a female protagonist is it's very typical of postmodern, but it's quite atypical of literature through time. So it's worth remembering that this is relevant to a reader in 2017 or 2018, very different way. But in the past couple of years, there have been thousands of global terror attacks. In total, I've looked, and there were about 1,200 in 2017, with fatalities at around 7,000. Figures are inexact, and it depends where you look. But it's a very serious problem. I think we all realise living in the climate we do how serious terrorism is. But I just thought it was worth noting that now the main culprit of the attacks is thought to be so-called Islamic State or ISIS, whereas if we're going back to 2001, 2002, the main terrorist group at that time was the Taliban, who, though they still exist and still do carry out terrorist attacks, today are less prominent. So, very simple points. The poem is made up of 8 stanzas with 5 lines, and the regular form gives it an authoritative tone, which backs up the fact that she now has a voice. Each stanza is end stops laid out as continuing lines, suggesting connection, and it could be a reminder of death as being final. You'll see when we look at the poem how those lines are continued. There are many cases of caesura, especially full stops within lines, and these highlight the disruption of life. You've got plosive consonants in the final stanza, so that's the alliteration of the P sound. Priest, pad, rip, post, president, drop, pews, that P. Very prominent with ideas of connection, and it mimics the pad of the feet. As a thing, a lot of strong dynamic verbs are used throughout. Parenthesis displays disruption and interrupts. So looking at the parenthesis, really where we have the quotation from the newspaper article of the 29th of October in the 5th stanza. And that links us back directly to the context. It's also worth noting that news is always capitalised and it appears as a proper noun. So these are my annotations. You might find it helpful to pause the video and copy or read through some of them, but I'm also going to talk through them. So, the news had often made her shout, but one day her voice ripped out of her throat like a firework with a terrible sulphurous crack that made her jump, a flash of light in the dark. Now she was loud. So, immediately seeing the fact that news is capitalised, and the fact that it had often made her shout suggests this common, quite regular, which is quite a sad reflection on the news of this time, but I think it's also quite a true one. Made as a verb suggests that she has no choice. And it's worth noting in the first line we use her, which puts us in a female focus. So throughout not only this stanza, so there's shout, ripped, terrible, sulphurous crack, scream, shriek, spear, wail. There are violent imagery, which I'll comment more on in the next slide. So you've got but one day, which specifically places you in a time period, and her voice ripped out of her throat, again suggesting that she has no choice, which is highlighted by the passive voice ripped out of her throat. And the way I usually check if something is passive or active voice is I use the standard test of by aliens. So you may or may not know that if you can have a sentence and if you add by aliens at the end of it, it makes sense, then that's in the passive voice, and if not, it's in the active voice. So here, her voice ripped out of her throat by aliens. The fact that the aliens ripped out her voice whereas the news had often made her shout by aliens doesn't make sense. Like a firework, we've got the light imagery. Worth noting that as four connections across text, light imagery is quite often used as a sign of hope. I think like a firework, it's an interesting simile, because if you've got a firework is explosive, it's unnatural, it is very loud, but it's also beautiful. Or a lot of people see fireworks as beautiful, and there is quite a conflict even within a firework. So you've got this question about whether her voice ripping out of her throat is good or bad. With the terrible sulphurous crack, so the adjective terrible has a double meaning. So you've got, on the one hand, there's this idea of it being purely negative, it being absolutely awful, but it can also be the idea of formidably great. You can use the adjective terrible to express something which is overwhelming and inspiring, but not necessarily frightening. Again, if we're looking at our AO4 connections across literary time, in the Odyssey, at the end, when Odysseus comes back, what he orders that that his house be purified by both fire and sulphur. So sulphur in the Odyssey is a way of cleansing, purification. So you've got this idea that the sulphurous crack, although it's terrible, it personally, to me, seems more like it's formidable, but it's also liberating. That made her jump. Again, repetition of made, the idea that she can't control this. A flash of light in the dark, relating back to light imagery, and a flash of light in the dark specifically suggests lightning, which contrasts with the firework, of course, because lightning is natural. The firework is unnatural, but lightning is natural, but it's also very dangerous. Now she was loud. That declarative is really quite poignant. It finishes it. It's a short line that we've got. You can see here where they connect on. Now she was loud, before she'd been easily led. But yeah, that declarative shows that this is a change with the now being the use of the time phrase. So before, she'd been easily led, one of the crowd, joined in with the national whoop for the winning goal, the boos for the bent MP, the cheer for the royal kiss on the balcony. Not anymore. Now she could roar. And I've actually realised, as I've just read that I missed one of the examples of internal rhyme, which you can, I've got some areas of code where internal, in many cases para rhyme, but also perfect rhyme, is marked by yellow, and I should have marked more and raw as yellow, and I didn't. But you've got two examples of that internal rhyme here: MP, balcony, and then more raw. We've got examples of Sujira in the second stanza. So royal kiss on balcony, not anymore, now she could roar. And the use of now. Prepositions are very common in this poem, but it's worth thinking about. In the first stanza, now starts the final line, sorry. And then the second stanza, instead of starting it, it actually is the end of the penultimate line. And just think about how that compares now. Talked about the national whoop and the fact that Duffy often, well, maybe not often, but she also utilises the verb whoop in, for example, beautiful and tall. So beautiful, you've got the crowd whooping for Marilyn Monroe, and in tall, someone gives a whoop while she's walking along. And this might only be in my experience, but I don't tend to use whoop very much in my everyday language, so I just thought it was worth picking up on that word choice. One of the crowd is a cliched image. Got the tricolon of joining in with the national whoop for the winning goal, boos for the bent MP, cheer for the royal kiss on the balcony. So it emphasises that she's been middle of the road, puts emphasis on that. You've also got the fact that they continue over the line, so it's very fluid. It's how it flows shows how she's just gone along with the crowd, and really highlights the difficulty of finding one's voice in society. And we've got the use of demotic, colloquial slang, really, for the bent MP. Very typical of Duffy, again. And the suggestion of raw, the suggestions of wild animals, particularly lions, and the link of that raw in with the violent imagery, which you see throughout the poem. So she practised alone at home, found she could call abroad without using the phone, could sing like an orchestra in the bath and yawn like thunder watching TV. She switched to the news. It was all about Muslims, Christians, Jews, and I see now that I haven't actually gone through this particularly thoroughly because, again, alone there should have been in yellow to mark that it rhymes perfectly with the phone and para rhyme with home. And it's worth thinking about how those ideas align. Alone, home, phone. Alone and phone especially, because alone there's the suggestion of isolation, whereas in the phone you've got this communication. Got two similes in this stanza, adding to the simile from the first stanza. And yeah, this thing like an orchestra in the bath is an unexpected simile, somewhat confusing to the reader. It seems quite absurd, and it could perhaps be highlighting how absurd some news is. Similarly, yawn like thunder is quite unexpected. So the fact that she could call abroad without using the phone. Adonation, linking to the extended metaphor of the whole poem, because I haven't actually mentioned this before, but the fact that her voice is an extended metaphor. It's worth noting that from 2003 people had access to Skype, so they could actually communicate abroad without using the phone. But it's also a reference to how news was becoming more international. That's quite a stretch, I'd say. It's quite a side point. It's something I personally thought might be interesting, but yeah. So you've got switching to the news, which we know has often made her shout, and it was all about Muslims, Christians, Jews, highlighting the importance of religion as a source of conflict in the world. And she notably lists the three major monotheistic faiths rather than polytheistic faiths. Religion is a very key theme in poem after this, History. Then her scream was a huge bird that flew her away into the dark, each fast wing a shriek awful to hear the beak, the sickening hiss of a thrown spear. She stayed up there all night in the wind and rain, wailing, uttering lightning. And this stanza, for me, really resonates with the later stanzas in Tall. So in Tall, the stars trembled. Taller was colder, alone and no wiser. What could she see up there? She told them what kind of weather was heading their way. I see real resonance. You've got the pathetic fallacy of the wind and rain imagery, and the fact that she's up in the air. The scream, we've got this incoherent fear, anger, the metaphor being a huge bird that flew her away. Again, she's got no choice, and it's quite ambiguous the way this is. You've got traditionally birds represent freedom, and they can actually represent finding her voice. You think of bird song. Yeah, I did find this stanza quite hard to interpret the first time I read the poem. We've got a link again to lightning, and the idea that actually her voice is unmissable, it's loud, it's clear. Down, she was pure sound, rumbling like an avalanche. She bit radios, swallowed them, gargled their news till the words ran into the church and sprayed the congregation with bullets no one has claimed. Gibberish, crap in the cave of her mouth. So again, a slightly random piece of context about national disasters to contemporary readers might be interesting, because there was a really bad avalanche in Russia in 2002, just after publication, which could affect how a contemporary reader would have read it. We've got the continuation of similes, like an avalanche, and metaphors, biting radios, swallowing them, gargled, with this quote, as I've already mentioned, from an article which appeared on the 29th of October, and which doesn't feel out of place for what could be seen in a newspaper article today. So she's quoting, which is quite typical of Duffy, and directly linking to the social conflict context. Again, we've got demotic language, which is typical of Duffy, linking her to her inspiration from Wordsworth. And it is harsh and hard-hitting, gibberish, crap. Especially when you're talking about violence like this. And the violence really comes into its own in the second half of the poem. Bullets, stomped, screeching, bellowing, bawled, hollered, buzzed, howled, shriek, bomb, bang, gun, screams. It really does accumulate. The metaphors and the personification is quite intense for these first two stanzas on the second page, obviously the fifth and sixth stanzas. Overall, you've got the reminder of the nature imagery, moving away from weather to countryside, rivers, woods, pit and sea. So the nature imagery is typical of love poetry, but here it's used negatively. But also the way she's yelling through the countryside, swelling the rivers, felling the woods she put out to sea, is this idea of international news, that things are spreading, and also the fact that this news affects everyone, highlighting to the reader that this news affects them, it affects all of nature. And anger in the idea that she bawled, hollered, howled, accumulation of these strong dynamic verbs. And it is, I would suggest it's tautology, bawling, hollering, howling, very similar meaning. Where fighter planes buzzed, so a buzz, if you're buzzed by a fighter plane, it's a kind of attack that happens in midair. It doesn't necessarily, it can be sort of a false attack though, where A pilot might pretend they're going to do something to another pilot without actually doing them. So it puts the pilot in a very scary situation, but isn't necessarily dangerous. This stanza, after two which are relatively metaphorical, apart from obviously this quote, we've got this stanza which is really focused on war, terrorism. It's highlighting barbarity, and then the pace is slowed in the final stanza with this place of alliteration, which we've talked about. So she bawled at the moon and it span away into space. She hollered into the dark where fighter planes buzzed at her face. She howled till every noise in the world sang in the spit on the tip of her tongue. The shriek of a bong, the bang of a gun, the prayers of the peace, the priest, the pad of the feet in the mosque, the casual rip of the post, the mother's sobs, the thump of the drop, the president's cough, the screams of the children cowering under their pews. Loud, loud, louder, the news. And that epizeusis of loud, loud, louder is spondyc, muter, accumulation, polyproton, and tricolon, if you really want to get some of your terminology. And that's really powerful. And then you end on the news, same words that we started on, which means it is cyclical. And I think it's especially poignant that Duffy does highlight how this affects the children cowering under their pews, because terrorism does affect everyone, and it sometimes affects the innocent most.